And before, so welcome everybody. Today we are here, we have the pleasure actually to have here Professor Dr. Valerie Lindsay, and she will introduce herself in a while, but exactly today we are here for the qualitative data analysis and the use of NVivo software webinar and some basic housekeeping. For those that are new to DoctorateHub, we typically record the webinar part, the webinar components. With this, also be aware that if you ask a question, this will be recorded. You can always use the chat, and I'm happy to read those questions loud to our host if you don't wish to do it yourself. After the webinar is over, we will switch off the recording, and then exactly you can ask any other question that you didn't want to have recorded during the session. You are much welcome to exactly share those questions afterwards. As said, today we are here for this webinar around qualitative and NVivo. I will perhaps ask Professor Dr. Valerie to introduce herself, and we'll take it from there.
Okay, so thank you, Dr. Anna, for the introduction. I'm very happy to be here. My first time contributing to this webinar series, which having looked through is extremely impressive. So I think we're very fortunate to have this opportunity all round. So I have been an academic for a few decades now, with some industry experience before that. My key area of research, as you've probably gathered, is in qualitative data collection and analysis, qualitative methodologies. I'd obviously like to share with you some experiences and things that I think are particularly relevant for doctoral students who are anticipating their methodology right now and thinking maybe they would like to proceed into qualitative methods and methodologies. I'm currently at the American University of Sharjah in the United Arab Emirates. I hail from New Zealand and have been here in the UAE for 10 years now. I've got to know a network of very experienced people such as Professor Bostian, who I think many of you will know. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to sharing with you my experience and ideas and receiving your ideas and comments as well. So when we're ready, shall I?
Exactly. Would you like to share the presentation, perhaps, to share your screen?
Sure. Yeah. Okay, I don't have permission by the looks of it. It says host disable participant screen share.
No, perhaps. Let me give it a try.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, there we are.
All right. So, okay, is that visible to everybody?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, excellent. So yes, the title, as you've seen, is Qualitative Data Analysis and the Use of NVivo Software. So this is not entirely on NVivo software. In fact, that will be in the second part of the presentation, because before embarking on deciding what kind of tools to use, we have to be really clear that we're using the right methodologies. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time just working through the appropriate use of choice of qualitative data collection and analysis, qualitative methodologies, and then I will go on to give you a very broad overview of NVivo. To learn NVivo takes some time, and it's certainly beyond the scope of this webinar. But if your appetite is whetted from this, then I'm sure there'll be opportunities to develop your skills in this particular area. Okay, so first of all, some doctoral clubs. This is very relevant to the areas in particular of research planning and research execution. So getting ready for data collection, which is really the first part of this presentation, and then the collection and analysis, which leads us into the use of NVivo. Okay, the learning outcomes. What are we trying to gain from this? Well, I think firstly to become broadly familiar with the process of qualitative data analysis. I really should separate that, and then becoming familiar with that process using computer-assisted qualitative data analysis software. An acronym that you might have seen, we'll come on to that later on, to describe a number of different software programs that can be used for qualitative data analysis. We also hope to impart an understanding of the key steps involved when you're using NVivo, particularly focusing on NVivo here for qualitative data analysis. And also, I think for particularly relevant here is how do you actually present this methodology in a journal publication or a PhD thesis. It's not necessarily straightforward. There's not necessarily a standard way. So I'll discuss some of the things that will be relevant for you in that respect. Okay, so I hope that's all good with everyone attending. Let's plow on to, I guess, the first question. Now, I'd just like to actually hide the video, so that makes it easier for me. The first question, is qualitative analysis, qualitative methodology right? Is it the most appropriate methodology to use for the research that you're engaged in? There are some very good rationales for this, and it's, I think, very important that these rationale, the justification for using qualitative methodology and qualitative analysis is really clear and understood before embarking on the process itself. Now, you may or may not be familiar with an absolutely excellent article that I've used with all the PhD students I've worked with, Edmondson and McManus, 2007, who provide a lot of guidelines in their paper for when to use quantitative methodologies, when to use qualitative, and when to use mixed methodologies. Now, this is only some perspectives, but it's an excellent guideline. Basically, if we look at theory first, the decision should be driven a lot by what do we know about theory in this area that I'm working in. Is the theory nascent, new? Is there any theory? Am I theory building? Or is theory still in the early stages of development? If that's the case, you will find there'll be very few tools available, very few scales, very few opportunities to draw on quantitative approaches. So qualitative research is all about exploration and fundamentally theory building. So if your research falls into this end of the graph, then qualitative is, for that reason on its own, probably the most likely and most appropriate form of methodology. We'll go to the opposite extreme. If you're working in an area where theory is very mature, it's been developed, there are measurement scales that have been developed, tested, validated, in use for some period, relevant to your context, then a purely quantitative study is probably the most appropriate way to go. Then we have this hybrid situation in the middle, where theory you could determine as being intermediate, not entirely new, but still not fully developed, and opportunities still for some both theory testing and theory building at the same time. Then maybe that's the opportunity for a mixed methods approach. And I know you've had some, already had some webinars available on mixed methodology. And here we're trying to balance what is the best mix of methodologies. And in particular, if that is a decision that you've made, yes, a mixed methodology is where I want to go. And some PhDs, you'll find some supervisors, some examiners recommending a mixed methodology for various reasons, not just theoretically based, but built around the scope of the studies that PhD students are doing. Let's assume that qualitative then is part of this, if not fully. What order, when should the qualitative research come into play relative to the quantitative? How do they interact in mixed methodology? Again, this is just a very brief overview, but there are some interesting guidelines here. Where does qualitative fit in a mixed methodology approach? Well, it can be done prior to the quantitative analysis, and very often is. So if the constructs, measures, etc., are still not fully developed, or you might be introducing a new variable into your conceptual framework or model, then qualitative analysis can add to confirming the constructs, variables, and measures that you'll be using. So a qualitative analysis can help to inform the hypothesis development that would then go on to be tested using quantitative methods. That's a very common way of using qualitative analysis to just confirm the model, the variables in the model and measures, or provide some new perspectives on maybe one new variable being introduced. The other option is to use quantitative analysis at the end of your quantitative study. So here, assume you have undertaken a quantitative analysis with your data. But one thing, the key difference between qualitative and quantitative is that the qualitative tells us a lot more about the how and why of those results. And if that's important, then it might be appropriate to use qualitative analysis after your quant to help you interpret the results. Now, equally valid, and in reality, many studies would actually use both. But that's a decision that needs to be made in the context of the research question and the model that's being, or framework and conceptualization involved. Okay, so let's focus now on qualitative research and take a bit of a practical overview. Probably the most among the most well-known, not entirely the most well-known, one of a few which I'll show you in the next slide, Miles and Huberman. They wrote their book on qualitative data analysis in 1994. There has been one update since then, but it has become the backbone of qualitative data analysis. So they claim, why do qualitative research? Well, they claim that qualitative data are generally rich and holistic. They reveal complexity and depth, and often in a vivid way, depending on how they're analyzed. Now, that's something that is not what would be found generally in quantitative research, but it can be a really excellent addition to quantitative research or can stand alone. Qualitative data are typically collected over a sustained period, which can certainly help understand process and even potentially causality, depending on the design of the research. And most importantly, it enables an understanding of meaning. I really stress that, it's the meaning of the data and ways of connecting those meanings with each other and to the social world. So they capture this concept extremely well. One of the other things they say, and this is where this will support the discussion coming up on NVivo and the use of computer-assisted analysis for qualitative data. Miles and Huberman have also got a very interesting quote. It says, and you may well be familiar with this, how can a researcher condense 3,000 or 300 pages of qualitative data into 2 pages in an article or a few more pages in a thesis without any track of how the thinking has gone to support that? So one of the biggest criticisms of qualitative research was that there was no audit trail. This is what the interpretation is, but how has the researcher got there? Miles and Huberman, even back in 1994, were saying, hey, that's a really big problem with qualitative research, and we need to find ways to deal with it. So we'll come on to how computer-assisted analysis software does, in fact, help with that question of really understanding how interpretations and conclusions are drawn from a large base of qualitative data. Now, I mentioned that Miles and Huberman were probably amongst the most well-known. I'm not ending with my references here. This is very much near the beginning of the presentation, which is a little unusual, but I'm putting these names here because they are relevant, highly relevant to qualitative research. Now, Miles and Huberman, obviously, I've just cited their most recent book. Yin, many of you be familiar with, particularly on case study analysis, and there's been several versions in that. I missed out the third edition. I think it might be the 6th or 7th, or possibly a lot more than that now. Eisenhardt is another name that you will probably become very familiar with if you're undertaking qualitative research. So Eisenhardt's 1989 Academy of Management Review paper was probably the classic, but the subsequent 2007 paper with Graebner was also extremely influential. So those are essential reads for qualitative research. Okay, so look at some key concepts in qualitative research. Again, I didn't actually put Glaser and Strauss, I don't think, in that list of key references, but they should be there. My apologies to Glaser and Strauss. There's an interesting story. They actually fell or drifted apart regarding their conceptual approach to qualitative research after their early classics. But fundamentally, they have built the idea of a grounded theoretic approach to qualitative data, where essentially theory emerges entirely from the data. This theory is grounded in the data. There's no thinking of theory. The data speak for themselves. So I guess being less pure in that sense, Miles and Huberman have introduced the concept of prior conceptualization or pre-conceptualization. And this is an area where Glaser and Strauss actually started to disagree. Prior conceptualization is where the researcher starts with some, it might be very small, but there will be some conceptualization around what it is they're going to be studying and prior conceptualization of what the data is trying to tell them. It's actually virtually impossible to go into any kind of research project without some thinking, without some conceptualization of what you're looking for or what you expect to find. So that probably is the most representative of the approaches taken. Yin, as you probably know, really highlights the difference between qualitative and quantitative research. With quantitative research, it's all about statistical replication. So numbers count, probabilities count. It's statistical and replicating ideas, findings statistically. Qualitative data, on the other hand, is about replicating theory. So it's a very different perspective. Theory may be partially developed or even fully developed from the data. And then we need to test that those theoretical perspectives rather than statistical findings in a qualitative setting. Now, Glaser and Strauss also really highlight the importance of meaning, which we've discussed before. And Miles and Huberman, as I've mentioned, insist that there has to be a logical path from the data to the conclusions being presented. So that provides an overview of, I guess, where qualitative analysis methodology sits relative to other kinds of methodologies, particularly the range of quantitative methodologies available. Okay. So we also have here, and this is looking again at the slightly different orientations that we find. Eisenhardt, that I mentioned as at 1989, one of a key contributor to qualitative data analysis, takes a slightly more positive orientation to qualitative research. That paper, she talks about, I think it's samples of 10 to 12, 10 I think, where there is quite a lot of pre-conceptualization going on. It's a little bit in between the quantitative and qualitative, though I must say much more qualitatively based. The principles, though, are fundamentally around the idea that there is some formulation of preconception of what it is you're looking for. We find in the qualitative range, we would find generally larger samples. I say she's talking about samples of around 10 or slightly more. The research questions and propositions are reasonably well formulated. And as you can see from the diagram, we start with the idea and then we look at cases or our sample, if you like, for exploring the research question that is in our head. Okay. So it's still qualitatively analyzing the ideas. It's looking at trying to see whether those ideas are reproducible across different cases and looking for similarities and differences and new ideas coming out of that. But it's driven from the idea and tested. The opposite approach, the grounded theory, which mentioned Glaser and Strauss really originated, and somebody called Stake, who you will also come across, I'm sure, has picked up on that idea of a grounded orientation, which is in fact kind of the opposite. In this situation, the case itself is the center of exploration. The idea emerges from the case. Whereas the Eisenhardt approach, the idea is kind of there to begin with, and then it's explored. Here, the case is explored and the ideas emerge. Again, we don't necessarily see either or situations, but it's important that the researcher is aware of the kind of approach that they're actually planning to take, because the interpretation, the validation, all of those things depend on that mindset that really kicks off the qualitative data analysis process. So what actually is qualitative data analysis? I think we've got a sense now of kind of where it sits, the different approaches that can be taken. It's not just one thing, there are many variations on the theme. I've only covered a few and very much superficially, but just giving you an idea of the things that you might want to explore later. This actually comes from Miles and Huberman. It's a really nice little flow of how qualitative data analysis takes place. There's not necessarily one starting point, but if we apply our logical thinking to this, we would start with data collection. And you'll see that all of these it's very iterative. They're all linked with one another, and we might go from one stage to another and then back again to that stage. But let's start with data collection. Generally, the next step in the process will be data reduction, where we're trying to actually make sense of the data after we've collected it. I'm not going to go very much at all into any of these in depth, but we will talk where NVivo comes in is helping with the data reduction. So we will talk more about that one. From data reduction, trying to make sense of what the data is telling us, and organizing the data and structuring the data. We can then hopefully draw some conclusions, and verify our theoretical position, etc. Then we have the question of, okay, how do we actually show that? How can we display our findings so that people can understand it in a publication or a thesis or a presentation? So that's the whole area of data display. And for qualitative data, there are many options available for showing the process of your interpretation and particularly what your findings are. At any one of those points, it might be necessary to go back to the previous point, particularly between data display and data reduction, as you can see. So again, a very well-established set of steps, if you like, but very iterative steps in the qualitative data analysis process. So very briefly on the collection, won't go into this in any depth at all, but just some key points. Obviously, in qualitative data research, we're looking at small samples, usually nested in their context, and they're studied in depth. Whether you're using Eisenhardt's approach or Stake's approach, this still applies. With Stake, the smallest sample size can in fact be 1. That has to be very well justified if it's going to be publishable, but it absolutely is possible to do that. And the analysis process and the data collection process, pretty complex. But nested in their context, so context is really important in qualitative data analysis, understanding the context, which we tend not to be able to do so easily in a quantitative setting. What kind of data do we collect? Well, I guess the most traditional would be interview transcripts or focus groups, written notes, existing written material, case studies, for example. There are many ways to capture qualitative data, but it's generally in a written form. However, you'll see in NVivo that we don't have to stick with the written form either. And then the in-depth why and how questions. So the questions would be either completely open-ended or unstructured or semi-structured, and that would be the choice of the researcher depending on what they're trying to find out. So data reduction, display and conclusion drawing, and verification, focusing mainly on the data reduction is about essentially trying to structure and organize the data so that you can start to build some patterns, some themes from what you've got, starting to make sense of it. And that's where NVivo is particularly useful. Data display. So I've got a little stylized table here on the right of the slide. You'll find that qualitative data are very often presented in table form. A classic kind of presentation is the content analytic matrix, where it's a very nice way of presenting the themes and patterns that have emerged and showing where they've come from, with, for example, quotes or some supporting data in the table. Miles and Huberman do a fantastic job in going through the various forms of data displays. It might be a network, it could be various things. But what it's doing is summarizing the findings that will then permit some drawing of conclusions and ultimately action. The conclusions themselves, this is what's deciding on what the things mean from the findings, noting regularities, patterns, explanations, possible configurations, causal flows, or propositions. So quite a lot of things there. But with some kinds of qualitative analysis or methodology, the choice of case, if you're looking at case studies, for example, or the sample, going back to the previous slide, the collection, Eisenhardt recommends taking samples that are similar or different, or have something completely unusual associated with them. Now, they can all be looked at together or separately, but there is a deliberateness around how the case studies themselves or the interviews, etc., are actually decided upon. And that will come through in the conclusion drawing and verification stage. So this is mostly about data reduction. And what I have on the right here is a screenshot of a small part of an NVivo screen. I don't know if any of you have used NVivo, explored it, might be expert in it. For those who have not seen it, this is an example of some of the output associated with the program. So data reduction is all about coding, looking for patterns and themes, organizing the data that's, as Miles and Huberman said, it might be 3,000 pages, 300 pages, who knows, trying to get some sense and pattern around that. There are a couple of key things which are important going into the more deeper analysis. We have what's called within case analysis and cross case analysis. I'll come on to that a little bit later, very briefly. That's the topic for another time, I think. Miles and Huberman also suggest that quantization is acceptable, and there are other supporting authors that would say quantization of qualitative data is okay in context. So if you're working with a larger sample following perhaps Eisenhardt's methodology, where we're looking at larger groups, finding out how many of these respondents felt this particular issue was important, for example. So essentially counting the data. It's absolutely not statistical, it's just inferential, but it can be useful. Particularly can be useful in guiding you where to look next. So the displays, how then do you display the data? I've mentioned cross-case display, this checklist, this matrices, or content analytic matrix is what I mentioned. Network diagrams, models, there's a big range, and NVivo helps with many of those, if not all. And again, I won't go into those here, it's beyond the scope of this webinar. And finally, how to report qualitative data in a thesis or in journal articles. My recommendation would be to look for different examples of different approaches. Some journals dedicate most of their publication to qualitative data, not many. Not all publish very much qualitative data, but increasingly that's far less of a problem. So look to see how other people do it, how other authors present their data. For example, it could be a description with in-text quotes, that's very common. You can use tables, as I've mentioned, a conceptual framework, either inductive or deductive, very useful, and a very nice output from qualitative data analysis. And as I mentioned at the beginning, it's a lot to do with theory building, ordering, discovering constructs and describing the findings and your interpretations. Okay, so that's been a rather helicopter view of why we are doing qualitative research, where it can be useful, and the different kinds of aspects associated with it. Now let's move through to have a quick look at NVivo. I just want to dispel a myth right at the beginning. And if you are thinking that this myth applies to you, you may want to reconsider after this webinar. The myth is that NVivo and other computer-assisted programs does it all for you. It's not quite like SPSS, where you put the data in, you choose what analysis you want, and out comes the answer. I'm not saying that's easy, it absolutely isn't, but NVivo is not like that, and no other computer program is. So it doesn't do the analysis for you. It simply is an organizing tool, and a tool that allows you through that organization to see things you wouldn't otherwise see. So how does it compare to standard non-computer-based qualitative data analysis? NVivo and other programs like it give you the opportunity to explore far larger quantities of data, and to explore, so it's allowing you considerably more breadth in the amount of data. It also facilitates increasing depth of analysis, which is very difficult to do without the kind of support that a computerized program can do. So yes, it has fantastic benefits, but it doesn't do the analysis for you. That is still very much the job of the researcher, and you'll see why in a moment. So I'm sorry to impart that news for anybody who might have been thinking otherwise. It is quite an investment. It's especially an upfront investment of time, but once the upfront investment has been made, the opportunities are limitless. Anyway, let's have a look at it. Let's go back a little. So there is this acronym CAQDAS, you might see in the literature as you read about qualitative methodologies, basically computer-assisted qualitative data analysis software. Now this includes NVivo, which was formerly called NUDIST, and that was non-numerical data something software something. I can't remember the actual acronym. I first started using this with the second edition of NUDIST, which would have been back in around the 1992 or early 90s. It's still made by the same company, Australian company, and it's developed phenomenally since then. And it's been called NVivo. I've got a picture here of NVivo 11. The last NVivo was actually NVivo 12, but there's now a more recent one where they have stopped giving it a number. It's just called NVivo. There are generally, in many cases, minor advances on the earlier editions. There have been some excellent developments though over the years. So NVivo is what we're going to be talking about, and that I guess is my go-to when I do computer-assisted, when I do qualitative analysis. There are other programs. Atlas, I think, is the second most widely used. NVivo is the most widely used in the world by researchers. Atlas comes close second. Very good. It's different. I use it for other purposes. I use it particularly for exploring literature, but both can do that actually. So I actually tend to have them both on the go. And there are many others. And what I've mentioned, it changes the balance between organizing and analyzing. It gives you much more time to analyze your data because these tools provide an organizing framework and the analytical tools to support. So coding sources. What can you code in NVivo? It's all about coding the data in order to get this organization. We'll see that in examples in a moment. Well, you can code almost anything. Anything written. You can also code audio tapes, videotapes, images, anything. In fact, most people who use this a lot would put their entire project in NVivo, including all the memos, the notes to yourself, communication with co-researchers, etc. It doesn't have to be just an add-on, it can actually encompass your entire project. And I would recommend that actually. So what is a case in NVivo? I'm going to go through these just shortly. A case is not necessarily a case study. So you'll see this term, some of you who have been using it already, maybe a case. NVivo talks about cases, and you can see here from the screenshot, it talks about cases. Not necessarily case studies, so it's important to get that differentiation sorted. A case in NVivo is an object of interest, a collection of similar things, of sources, a collection of similar sources. So in this case, and we can see here, cases are people and places. I've expanded people, and they've got categories of people: interview participants, survey respondents, and something to do with social media. So a case is anything of any source of interest, not necessarily a case study at all. So just be conscious of that difference. So yeah, an example, it could be one interview, it could be a person, it could be a journal article, however you want to classify it. Within and cross-case analysis, very briefly, with NVivo, you would start off analyzing, I don't know if you can see my cursor here, this top single case, whether it's an interview, most likely, let's take the simplest form. You would start analyzing that interview. You might then start to build up some patterns and themes emerging from that. So this interview might be discussing urban development, and a theme might come through that there needs to be some things for children or environmental friendly activities or something like that. So you create, with this underlying these themes, you're creating a coding structure. Ideas, basically, codes of ideas that reflect what's in that interview. Then you analyze all the other interviews, and those themes both contribute to and emerge from the rest of the interviews as well. And so there's this constant back and forth and collective thinking around the patterns and themes across all of your cases. And that's called cross-case analysis. Again, much more opportunity later, possibly, for more in-depth discussion of that. Coding and nodes. We'll look at NVivo just very briefly in a second so these make a little bit more sense. But the most important, the very first thing you do with NVivo is to take your data and code it into these ideas or concepts. NVivo calls the codes nodes. So it just makes it a little bit harder. So a code is a node, it's a concept. There's open coding. Basically, you're reading this interview and there's a whole bunch of ideas pop out, and you just code them accordingly. Open coding, no relationship between them whatsoever. Axial coding is a slightly more advanced way of looking at your data. It's where you cluster ideas together. So this one here might, as I mentioned, might be a node in this case, might be urban development, and these might be environmentally friendly projects, community activities, children's events. All of these things would all be clustered together if they're related. So it's a kind of a tree, gives you the idea of a tree organization. And then finally, the most sophisticated way of looking at your data is what we call system closure, where you've actually got a whole bunch of relationships between nodes, and these would have their little subnodes coming from them as well. The modeling capability in NVivo is really helpful in producing this generally a network approach, achieving system closure. And that's the level of analysis that is extremely difficult to do manually. Okay, coding style, different ways of coding. You might be you might want to set up the pre-conceptualization. You will set up a coding structure before you actually start delving into your data too far. Or you might start with the data and code as you go through it. In reality, it's both of those. And this is a fluid process. So looking at the time here, I want to get through to show you some how actually to do it. So coding is the first thing you do. You basically go through your material and you pull out the themes, the categories, the concepts, the ideas that you want to explore further, and that reflect what is in that material, that data. Oopsie. So the idea, as I've mentioned, is to create patterns and themes between the ideas that you are pulling out of the data. So how do you do this? I've got, again, just a couple of illustrative points before we have a quick look at NVivo. See how the time's going. I think we might have hopefully time for a couple of minutes on that. So here on the right is, for example, an interview. Okay, it's just a bunch of lines, but let's assume those are words. And the first thing to do, really, really important, is to read, and start manually coding. It's impossible to get really useful analysis in NVivo or other computer software without really understanding your data to start with. So you've got to become familiar with your data, read the interviews, make notes, start creating some possible nodes or coding structure just to get familiar with it. And I would suggest just doing it manually until you're really used to the process on the first page or first few pages of your first interview. So that I think is really important. So here's an example. Once you get to do the coding, this little bit here, let's say this sentence was actually a concept node 1, a concept around children's activities for this urban development. Actually down here, a bit further down that interview, they mentioned that topic again. So I recode that also in node 1. And then node 2 was something else. Maybe this was about environmental issues. This sentence or couple of sentences. Further down, I see some more reference to that. So I also code that in node 2, etc. So that's the kind of approach. It's slow, but once it's there, you can do infinite things with it. You can also code, don't worry about what I've got in the writing there, but you can also code into more than one node. So let's say this first sentence was about children's activities. It might also have been about community, the loss of a community hall or something like that. So different concepts relate to that very same sentence or couple of sentences. Therefore, you can code it in more than one place. This is a massive advantage over little cards, file cards that we used to keep in the old days when we were coding, because you could only ever do one. Now you've got the option to code into as many different codes as relevant. Okay, let's have a very quick look through the interface. Stop sharing that. And are we okay for time, Anna, for another 5 minutes?
Yes, sure. I think it will be a very useful experience.
Okay, cool. So when you first click into your NVivo on your desktop or your file, wherever you've got the program, this is the first screen that will appear. And you have the option here for three things. Blank project. So if you're starting your project, you start there. There's a sample project if you want to play around, and I thoroughly recommend you do that and spend quite a lot of time going through the NVivo resources, and they've got some really good samples. NVivo really supports researchers exceptionally well with peripheral tools and information. I've never used that. And there's another sample project. Now down here is actually the projects that you already have. This one here is actually a sample project from NVivo, the Environmental Change Down East. This is my project. Seem to have got that loaded up twice, the Environmental Change Down East. And this is also my project, and this is also my project. So the projects stay there. If I want to go into any of those projects again, I just click them. So let's just quickly go into their sample, one of their samples, which is about environmental change down east. These are sociologists, not actually my field, but some of the, it still kind of makes sense. All right, so very quickly, I'm not going to necessarily go through everything, but this is Down here on the left is your navigation pane where you drive the program. The main, what you see across the screen is where what you're working on shows up. And that will change, as you'll see. And probably the two most important things as you start is your sources and your nodes. So creating the nodes, this coding structure from whatever source or sources you're using, whether they be interviews or case studies or focus groups, whatever. So these are the first things that you need to become familiar with, and that forms the foundation of your project. Basically, that's it. The rest are pretty much all to do with analysis and ways to support your analysis. But before you can analyze what's in NVivo, you have to create it, of course, in NVivo. There's no shortcuts. As I say, there is a big investment up front, but as you can imagine, once it's here, you can do infinite things with it. You can add to it, go back to it time and time again, try different ideas, reanalyze it. It's there forever. And I've been playing with the database with some colleagues, a huge one, 160 interviews that we did back in 2011. And we're still going back and finding new concepts emerging from it because we're just going back and looking at it through different lenses. And that doesn't take much time. Okay, so if, let's say you have interviews, and an internal is something that you analyze inside NVivo. And they've got a bunch of stuff here: interviews, literature, news articles, social media, etc. So let's look at their interviews. You click on that, and here is the activity screen. And they've got a bunch of interviews here. That's written, so they've got a transcript there. This is an audio or video, that's video. So you can also analyze videos. More text, this is an audio recording of an interview with Helen, and Ken is also a video, and the rest are basically written. So let's have a look at Barbara very quickly. You can double click on these, and here you have the entire interview. Okay, and this was actually done, this was a fairly structured interview because you can see they have specific questions that apply to every participant. But this is her response, and that's what you've got to analyze. What does, she was saying all of this, what does it mean? I won't go into that now at all because we just don't have the time and scope, but as I say, the resources in NVivo are really excellent. So that's what you see there. Video, well, maybe I don't want to open it, let's do the audio. Just show you an audio, and along here, I didn't. Here's the audio from Helen. And so you've got the time segments and the content. Okay, so you can play the content has also been transcribed. So if any of you are working with interviews or focus groups, case studies, the most common thing, you'll have your interviews in here when you look at that. You can also put literature in there, news articles, whatever is relevant. When you don't want these anymore, because that can crowd out that space a bit, just close them. You don't lose anything. All right. There was some color coding going on that you saw. So that's your most important first starting point. How do you code? I'll very briefly do a coding for you so you can see. So let's take this sentence here. My family moved here when I was 2 years old. My parents. Okay, so I haven't read all of that, but let's say you want to code all of that into family history. So the code might be, in this case, family history. Many ways to do it. I generally right click and code. I can code it to existing codes or nodes, or I can create a new one. Let's create a new one and we'll call it family history. I'm doing this just to quickly show you. Okay, now that's coded in family history. let's go and look at some nodes to see how this all fits out. You would do this for every interview, not necessarily every sentence that you read, but everything that's relevant. You would need to do this coding for. So where do these codes turn up? There's family history, it's just turned up. So basically these nodes are what I have coded from the interviews. This is already in the project, all of these. So there was a code called attitude, or node called attitude, and that's been broken down into different parts: mixed attitude, negative, neutral, or positive attitude. And each one of these, just double click, comes back with what has been coded in what interview. So Barbara said this about, she had a mixed attitude, and this is how she expressed that. Betty and Paul, on the other hand, also had a mixed attitude, and this is what they said: I have a kind of mixed feelings about that. Well, that makes sense. So each one of these nodes tells you exactly what has been coded into it from what interview. Now here's family history that we added, and there's that sentence that I coded from Barbara. Okay, that gives you an idea of how these structures emerge. Again, some of you may be familiar with that, some less familiar. The analysis itself can take place in all sorts of ways. There's a very good query structure that you can use with many different types of queries you can make. How does family history relate to location of the participant, or something? You can combine anything. You can ask any question. You can actually form relationships physically, which will then show up in a network diagram. You can classify into different types of things. So the interview classifications by the interviewer. So did one interviewer find a different set of results when they interviewed Barbara? You can do it by date. What about all these interviews we did last year? Are they similar to what we've done this year? It's infinite. You can have reports, maps, which basically are network maps, and just another folder structure. So I will stop here in the interest of time, but just back for those of you who have not yet used NVivo, who are interested in it, these two, the sources and the nodes, are where you'll be working, spending most of your input time, and then the rest gives you, it's like, you know, a child in a sweet shop. You can have so much fun looking at the different ways to analyze and make sense of the data. So
exactly, there's a question in the chat where exactly you just answered, but can we relate cause and effect as nodes?
Can you relate cause and effect as nodes? Yes, you can. But bear in mind, we're not talking about cause and effect the same way that we do statistically with quantitative analysis. So there's something which I use a lot here called relationships, relationship types. And what you do here is generally relate one code to another. So let's say family history. Family history caused the family to move apart. Also cause different locations. I know, I can't think of a very great, or let's say the community closure was caused by people moving away. That would make more sense, wouldn't it? So let's say you wanted to look at those two things. You wanted to look at community, closure of community events and activities, and you're also looking at the extent to which people have moved away. Those are two separate nodes. And you want to say, is there a cause or effect relationship here? You have to make that decision. Do you think there's a cause and effect? If so, you would make that link inside NVivo so you can refer to it later and bring it up later. And you can use, these are kind of relationships. So you could say it's associated with, contributes to, impacts, it's married to these, so these are not all relevant, or you can make your own. So you could create a new relationship type. Say and that's causes. That's right. I've made a new relationship type. So I could actually then, I won't explain how to here, but you can link those two nodes, community event closures, population moving away. You could say population moving away has caused community event closures. And so you just make that relationship explicit. And you might find data from other people who are inferring the same thing. But again, all of NVivo is essentially the judgment of the researcher. There's no statistics in here. There's no probabilities. There's no, verification of, statistically. It's all the researcher's own interpretation of the data. And if you're doing a really important study, you wouldn't be able to do this in a PhD just because of resources and time. But if you're wanting to publish somewhere, very high quality journal, or for whatever other reason where you need really high quality analysis, you would generally try to have two coders, maybe two co-authors, looking at the same data and both coding them independently to see whether, in fact, the thinking is relatively, in sync with each other. There's a facility in NVivo that allows you to compare the coding between two coders with the same data to see how close together they are in their thinking and interpretation. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Any other questions? Okay.
Are there any other questions you would like to share during this recording? And if not, I would love to thank you, Professor Dr. Valerie, for such a rich knowledge and experience-packed session. It was very, very enlightening. This is, as a takeaway, we often are asked exactly by students, should I use NVivo for my PhD, and it's exactly important to stress that NVivo is very supportive, exactly for analyzing the data, but that exactly there is, effort, quite some effort that is required to set it up, to exactly be able to use it to its best performance. And that's, as also mentioned, it's just the researcher is still the one doing it. Yeah, so it's not that he's doing the job and the work for the researcher. No, it's still you that owns the data, and it's still you that exactly needs to go through the data and make these initial codes, these initial notes. I suggest that I now stop the recording, and that if there are questions that we can exactly address them afterwards. So bear with me, please.